right now. Good morning, Mike. How are you today?
Morning, Tony. I'm very well, thanks. And thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I think you recently put together a fantastic piece talking about corporate PPA. And that's what I had to fight to make sure that I can get you into our platform, Renewables in Africa, which I would like to remind people, Renewables in Africa is a clean energy champion, right? So championing the cause of renewables energy across the continent, and would like to bring forward to you experts in the field that can give you more insight and valuable insight. So today we have Mike Webb, Senior Associate at Baker Mckenzie, and we're going to be exploring a topic that is very well talked about across the continent nowadays. We're talking about corporate PPA. So Mike, just to start and to give justice to your fantastic career so far and the firm that you represent, would you mind giving us a bit of an understanding of who you are and who is Baker Mckenzie, please?
Absolutely. So as you said, I'm a senior associate in our Johannesburg office here at Baker Mckenzie. Baker Mckenzie is a global law firm. It's in fact, it was the first global law firm founded over 50 years ago, with 77 offices around the world. As a full service law firm, we cover various sectors and industries. Myself personally, I'm focused in the energy and infrastructure sectors, and obviously have had quite a bit of experience in the renewable energy sector, where we, as Baker Mckenzie, we advise clients from developers to project sponsors to financiers, really across the sort of spectrum in developing various types of projects. And we've had a fair bit of experience in Africa over the last few years. The renewable energy practice at Baker's has been very successful around the world. So obviously in hot markets like the US and in Europe, Australia and in Asia, and sort of more recently in Africa.
Okay, thanks for that. Great. So as I mentioned in my introduction, so you recently put together a very fantastic piece. So talking about corporate PPAs, and you've been given some very interesting information, and I was wondering if it's possible to give us takeaways, insight from that piece.
Yeah, sure. So what we did actually, the piece originated from a report that we coordinated here at Baker's, and the report sort of looked at the regulatory framework applicable in several African countries. The framework applicable to corporate PPAs. So with the intention of really trying to understand what those frameworks look like, what challenges there are currently at play, and what opportunities we can find. I think one of the key constraints with corporate PPAs is that many sort of stakeholders within the market don't really understand what exactly they are, who can kind of benefit from them, so this report was really an attempt to try and help sort of educate the market and unlock some of those opportunities. So we looked at 9 different countries. I think we can sort of safely assume, I mean, obviously each country is very much its own country and it has its own framework. So we can't, make assumptions that are kind of standardized across the board. But I would say that there does seem to be a general trend of, one of the sort of key issues being some challenges around the licensing of these types of projects. So more often than not, there is a fairly low threshold that is in place in these countries where projects sort of usually above a megawatt require a generation license. And those licenses can be difficult to come by. They're fairly sort of time consuming, and there's still a fair bit of uncertainty as to whether you're actually going to obtain the license. So that was one of the sort of key takeaways. I think one of the other issues we encounter with corporate PPAs is just generally it's more of a macro kind of issue is what the policy is that's applicable to these projects and really to renewables in general. And that sort of policy uncertainty is obviously a deterrent or an issue when looking to develop these projects, and financiers and investors need as much sort of project certainty and policy certainty as they can find. Now, I can say there were a few positives that came from this report, and a couple of markets where reforms are slowly but surely moving ahead. And those types of reforms are the sort of policy reforms that will help these opportunities. So I'm sure we can get into the details, but yeah, those were some of the key takeaways from the report and from that article.
Excellent, very interesting. And why would you say those corporate PPAs are important to Africa? You mentioned two key markets, be good to name them, but why is it important in general for the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one needs to just take a step back and look at corporate PPAs in general, and perhaps on a global basis, where corporate PPAs have been a fast-growing trend across the globe. So I sort of see it as two key drivers that play or that drive corporate PPAs. So the first is the economics. Sort of electricity price certainty, as well as trying to bring your electricity costs down. Through, I guess, the last 5-10 years, as you would well know, the costs of various renewable technologies have decreased quite dramatically, in particular solar PV and wind. And those cost reductions, coupled with some fairly sort of sharp increases in grid tariffs, as well as increases in the volatility of grid tariffs and grid prices in markets around the world, has led customers and obviously sort of large energy users to feel the need that they need to take the control back around their power prices. So they look at these PPAs, these corporate PPAs, as basically sort of hedge instruments against, first and foremost the volatility of their power costs, and then obviously if they can, a way to reduce those power costs. So that's the sort of economics bucket. Secondly, then there's obviously the sustainability driver. And I think that driver is also really picked up over the last more recent years, in fact, where you've got more and more global initiatives. I think you may know of the RE100 as an example, which is an initiative where large companies, multinationals, sign up and commit to using 100% renewable energy, those types of things, as well as just pressure, pure and simple, from their sort of large shareholders, pension funds, institutional investors, who all have identified the major risk that climate change has, as an investment risk, and are starting to put pressure down into their portfolio companies and into their investment targets to really start sort of investing in sustainable infrastructure. And obviously renewable energy projects such as this are one of the first ways in which companies sort of look to do that. So economics and sustainability, and those two buckets apply very much the same in Africa, I would say. Companies looking to do those two things. And then in Africa, you've obviously also got a third bucket, which is the reliability of energy supply, more so than other developed markets. In many developing countries with less reliable grids, we tend to see, either load shedding or power cuts having seriously sort of detrimental impacts on businesses. So trying to bring about a more reliable supply of electricity is a major driver we in South Africa experience. Load shedding but too more often than we would like, and we're definitely seeing that play a big part in getting companies to do this. And then the last point I'd like to make on that is also, from a renewables perspective, I guess projects are developed in various ways. More often, they're developed in ways to sell under PPAs with utilities. But obviously, there's challenges to that. It comes back to the sort of policy certainty and whether utilities have that kind of investment mandate. Corporate PPAs provide a very nice way in which to keep the renewables market growing and keep the traction going. And obviously that's important for any industry that is a fairly sort of new industry and needs that type of growth.
I think you described that very well, the importance of the corporate PPA, and that's right to do so. So you mentioned to market before. So how can we spread that across the whole 55 countries across in Africa? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, look, I guess that's the $1 million question, right? I mean, I think, as I said, so first and foremost, it comes down to a policy situation, and where, basically solving that is the first bottleneck. Are you as a country committed to a more clean and diversified sort of supply of energy? And then, I mean, this really, it has to, it does depend. There's, like you said, there's 55 countries. We can't, these don't apply uniformly across the board. But in most cases, there does need to be an improvement in the sort of policy framework. Like I said, it's also about trying to explain the benefits of corporate PPAs to all stakeholders within the industry. So, to the regulators, the utilities, the distributors, and ultimately the consumers, assuming that depending on each market there is a benefit to something like this, then we need to try and explain all of those benefits and sit down and tease out all the challenges and really try and come out with a solution that keeps everyone happy. I mean, I think that's also important. We do have our own challenges in many African countries, where economic growth is first and foremost the sort of top priority. So socioeconomic inclusion and things like that also need to be brought into the equation. Job creation is important. So those factors need to kind of all be thought about. Sorry, I see I've lost.
No problem.
Lost the light. That wasn't load shedding.
Sustainability.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think those are obviously the two sort of those are the more larger scale. Smaller, more practical thoughts are ways to spur this type of growth on are things like net metering, paying consumers who release some of their unused energy back into the grid. That would very much help the market. I guess I don't want to go into this topic too much because it's very complicated. But there's also thermal or at least fossil fuel generation does come with a price that's very seldomly actually taken into account, which is its impact on in the environment, and so some way of pricing carbon, whether it's through a carbon tax or some other sort of instrument, would also obviously lend its way to the renewables and the growth of these types of instruments.
Excellent. Now, to the benefit of developers, but also investors who are looking at corporate PPA, as you say, as a way to step into the market, can you tell them what makes a corporate PPA bankable?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I think first and foremost, there needs to be that market certainty, and that comes really at the policy stage, that this is going to be around for, at least there's going to be an accommodation of these types of projects from a policy point of view. If that sort of certainty is in place, then I think what developers and financiers would look to next is the credit worthiness of their off-takers, and that becomes a bit trickier, I would say. Well, in some respects, it's actually better, or it can be better with a corporate PPA. You might often find your corporate has a stronger credit rating than a distribution company or a utility, depending on the type of market you're operating in. But often, sometimes they obviously might not. And I think one of the key issues with corporate PPAs is the length of the PPA, the term of it, and certainly when banks and investors need to take a view on a corporate, and they need to be comfortable that that corporate is going to be in business for the next 20 years. If it's a 20-year PPA, then there's a fair bit of analysis and comfort that needs to be brought about. Obviously, there's ways of working around that particular issue. You can try and reduce the term of the PPA, and we've seen that in other markets, in Australia, in Europe, where corporate PPA terms are reduced to as far down to 10 years, for example. The upshot of that is that the price is then going to be higher. So that's something that needs to kind of be weighed up. But certainly, first and foremost, you're going to have to get comfortable around the credit rating, and then there's obviously other credit enhancement instruments that investors and banks will look to put in place. I guess coupled with that is a way in which, if you're not quite comfortable with one corporate's bankability, you might want to try and incorporate several corporates into one sort of offtake arrangement, sort of known as an aggregated corporate PPA, and that has the advantage of spreading that offtake risk across several off-takers. So you try and find like an anchor off-taker, like you have an anchor tenant, and you then sort of work around that. So that's a fairly nice way. I mean, it has its own challenges. And then the usual bankability kind of requirements flow from that. Project certainty, completion certainty, price certainty, and then the local market is always going to be an important aspect. Whether do you need sort of local partnerships? Is this the community involvement? I think is a big factor particularly in many African countries, where land arrangements are often regulated within a community, and so ensuring that you've actually gone through the right channels to obtain your land permits is always important.
I can see that one of the biggest issues is certainly the policy certainty, the regulatory framework. So once a client or a developer and investor is decided to move into a market, how does Baker's support this client?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. So we sort of see ourselves as really being a business partner to our clients, and particularly clients who are less familiar with various sort of African countries and kind of entering them for the first time. So we would sort of kick things off with a sort of full analysis of the project in the form of a due diligence report, for example, where we assess exactly sort of what the structure and the look of the project would look like, identify the key risks where the project is in terms of those risks, and identify the mitigation strategies for those, and then obviously then sort of lay down a plan for the investors to move through the development process of the project, ultimately sort of reach a financial close, and then go ahead and build the project. We would then assist with all the sort of documentation that goes with that process. So we do the full sort of spectrum of the legal documents, from the project agreements like the PPAs, like the construction contracts and operation contracts, through to the corporate structuring of the project and the financing arrangements, and the sort of loan agreements with if there is going to be debt involved, and then there's the advisory side as well. So these are, like I said, these are new markets, and there's tax considerations, there's exchange controls considerations, and regulatory considerations, and for all sort of local law requirements, and for the whole project as a whole, we partner with our chosen law firm. So we have identified chosen partners in countries in all 55 countries, and we work closely with those firms in various different departments across the firm globally. So we have that working relationship with the local advisors, and we kind of see ourselves as providing a single sort of legal service across the firms.
Okay, that's brilliant. So I like what you have described, which is actually a structured and organized method to source project, which is exactly what we're advocating here in Renewables in Africa. And that's why we are rolling out our first workshop, which is going to be looking at the inside, but also how to source effectively project in Africa. So thank you for basically explaining to people here that it's more than just asking a simple guy, so how can you find a project for me? So last question for you, which is important. So what is the typical size of corporate PPA project that you see in Africa at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, it goes back to the initial point or challenge that we have in some of these countries where licenses are required for projects in excess of 1 megawatt. So firstly, there's a fairly big market and opportunity for the very smaller distributed energy projects, so more on the sort of rooftop size projects that fit within that megawatt restriction, and they typically are for your commercial industrial types of companies that have a load that only needs sort of up to 1 megawatt. In excess of that, at the moment, like I said, it's a bit constrained with these licensing issues, but we would see projects going up to 50 megawatts, I'd say, at this stage. One of the first opportunities or industries to grapple with these corporate PPAs is in the mining and the resources sectors. So and that's been at play for quite a while in Africa. And those projects, I guess, range between 20 and 50 megawatts, and then are structured in various types of ways. Certainly, globally, we've seen projects that go all the way up to 200, 300 megawatts. Some of those would involve multiple off-takers, so sort of clubbed together deals. But in Africa, I guess maybe because we're sort of in the earlier stages, between 10 to 50 megawatts, and really anything in between there.
Okay, excellent. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were talking to Mike Webb, so Senior Associate at Baker Mckenzie. So, Mike, it was a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you to feeding us with all those very good information, and I'm sure everybody will find that very interesting for them.
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. Thanks for having me, and look forward to keeping in contact.
Thank you. We certainly will.